I came to the office to surprise my husband with a romantic trip to Paris for Valentine's Day. But when I walked into the atrium, he was standing in front of 200 cheering employees, sliding a diamond engagement ring onto the finger of another woman. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just turned around, walked back to my car, and silently withdrew my 83% ownership share from his company, worth over $500 million. 30 minutes later, my phone showed 152 missed calls. I did not open my front door right away. I stood silently in the grand, sweeping hallway of our luxury home in Westport, Connecticut. My wool coat was still buttoned, my purse was still hanging heavily from my shoulder, and the dead Valentine's flowers were lying discarded on the cold marble kitchen island behind me. The expensive red roses had been wrapped in thick cream paper with a luxurious satin ribbon. It was the exact kind of overdone, theatrical, romantic arrangement Jake always said he loved because it made him feel old school. I had bought them that morning from a charming little flower shop near the train station, along with a card I had painstakingly written by hand. Because after 14 years of marriage, I still foolishly believed that real love deserved genuine effort. The 2 first-class flight tickets to Paris had been tucked securely inside that card. Friday evening departure. 4 nights at an incredibly romantic, small boutique hotel near Saint-Germain, the exact same neighborhood where Jake and I had spent our honeymoon years ago. We had gone there back before his suits became custom-tailored in Milan, before his arrogant, smiling face appeared on the covers of major business magazines, before people stood up a little straighter and lowered their voices when he entered a corporate boardroom. That morning, drinking my coffee, I had happily imagined the look of sheer, overjoyed surprise on his face when he saw the tickets. By noon, I had seen his face while he was passionately kissing his female CEO. The doorbell rang again, longer, harder, and more desperate this time. Then came Jake's frantic voice, muffled through the heavy, solid oak front door. "Emma, please, open the door." I looked down at my phone, resting on the console table. Another call came in from him. The screen lit up with the caller ID photo I had never bothered to change. It was a picture of Jake in a simple navy sweater, smiling genuinely at me from the wooden deck of our very first modest house. It was taken back before the distinguished gray dusted his temples, before the $50,000 watch, before raw, corporate ambition had hardened into toxic entitlement. I let it ring. "Emma, I know you're in there," he yelled, his voice actually cracking with panic. "Please, just talk to me. Talk." It was strange how incredibly small and pathetic that words sounded after the colossal scale of what I had just witnessed. At exactly 11:42 that morning, I had walked into the sprawling, sunlit lobby of Harlow Reed Technologies with a beautiful bouquet of roses in one hand and a slim, black envelope containing the Paris tickets in the other. The corporate building was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all soaring glass, polished concrete floors, massive living green walls, and a reception desk that looked more like an ultra-luxury boutique hotel than a tech headquarters. I had not visited the office very often in the past few years, partly because I deeply preferred my privacy as an introvert, and partly because Jake had slowly, systematically trained everyone to think of the company as his exclusive world, not ours. Still, I had expected someone to recognize me. Maybe not the brand new receptionist, a young woman with perfect winged eyeliner and a wireless headset, but surely someone from operations, someone from finance, someone who had been around long enough to remember when this empire was just 12 exhausted people working out of a cramped, rented office above a noisy dental clinic in Stamford. Instead, the young receptionist barely glanced up from her glowing monitor. "Are you here for the celebration?" she asked brightly, gesturing toward the main floor. I smiled, naturally assuming Jake had arranged some lavish Valentine's Day office party for the staff. He was incredibly good at those things. The highly visible gestures, the expensive champagne, the charismatic motivational speeches, the carefully staged, Instagram-ready generosity. "I suppose I am," I said softly. She pointed toward the massive central atrium. They're just getting started." I heard the deafening applause before I even saw the crowd. There must have been over 200 employees gathered under the massive glass skylight. They were clustered tightly around a small, elevated platform heavily decorated with white roses and elegant gold balloons. Someone had actually hired a live string quartet. Dozens of people were holding up their phones, recording the moment. The company's sleek, glowing logo loomed massive behind the stage, and standing perfectly centered beneath it was Amanda Blake. She was the new, brilliant CEO Jake had aggressively headhunted and hired 18 months earlier. I had officially met her only once, at a stuffy charity dinner. She was Ivy League educated, impeccably polished, and younger than me by nearly a decade. She sported a sharp, stylish blonde bob and possessed the kind of calm, lethal confidence that made men confuse beauty with competence, even though she happened to have both in spades. Jake stood right beside her. He was smiling in that highly public, charismatic way of his, wide, confident, and practiced. One hand was casually resting at the button of his bespoke jacket, as if he had been born standing under a spotlight. And then he dropped to one knee. The entire room erupted into a deafening roar of cheers and whistles. For one agonizing, suspended second, my brain completely and utterly refused to translate what my eyes were seeing. I thought perhaps it was a skit, a bizarre company joke, some ridiculous, over-the-top morale-building stunt for a new product launch. But then Amanda covered her mouth with both hands, genuine tears welling in her eyes. Jake reached into his jacket pocket and snapped open a black velvet box. Even from 20 feet away, the massive diamond caught the atrium sunlight perfectly. It was a flawless emerald cut, the exact same specific cut I had once told him years ago was my absolute favorite. The employees cheered louder, clapping and whistling as Amanda nodded her head vigorously. Jake took her hand and slid the multi-million-dollar ring onto her finger. Then he stood up, tenderly cupped her face in his hands, and kissed her. It was not a nervous kiss. It was not a drunken mistake. It was not something confused, brief, or accidental. A man does not kiss a woman like that in front of 200 people unless he has already practiced betraying his wife in his mind 1,000 times. I felt the heavy bouquet of roses slip slightly lower in my hand, my fingers going numb. A young woman standing near me in the crowd clutched her heart and whispered to her coworker, "Oh my God, can you believe it? They are so completely perfect together." Perfect. That single, whispered word seemed to echo, and it was that word that finally made Jake turn his head. His eyes swept over the cheering crowd and instantly found mine across the atrium. For half a second, all the deafening noise, the clapping, and the music in the massive room seemed to fold entirely into itself, creating a vacuum of total, terrifying silence. The charismatic, triumphant smile completely vanished from his face. All the color violently drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a corpse in a tailored suit. He knew I had seen absolutely everything, and still he did not come to me. He did not call out my name. He did not step off that illuminated platform. He just stood there, paralyzed by his own arrogance and cowardice, his hand still resting on his new fiancée's waist. Amanda noticed his sudden, horrific shift in posture. She followed his terrified gaze and looked directly at me. Her expression was one of polite, mild confusion, the exact kind of look a gracious hostess gives to a party guest she simply cannot place. "I'm sorry," she mouthed softly over the noise, her brow furrowing almost kindly. "Do we know each other?" That was the exact moment I truly understood the depth of the betrayal. Jake had not just cheated on my body. He had completely, systematically erased my entire existence from his reality. I didn't drop the flowers. I didn't scream. I turned around on my heel and walked away before my dignity could bleed out onto the polished floor in front of 200 strangers. No one stopped me as I walked briskly back through the sunlit lobby. The new receptionist smiled brightly again, still entirely clueless, still cheerful. "Have a great Valentine's Day," she called out. I made it all the way down to the underground parking garage and got inside my car before my hands started violently shaking. I sat in the driver's seat with the dead roses resting on the passenger side and the black Paris envelope sitting heavily in my lap. I closed my eyes and listened to the faint, echoing sound of applause still trapped sickeningly in my ears. I could have screamed. I could have stormed back into that atrium, marched up onto that stage, thrown those red roses violently into his cheating face, and given everyone in that company the explosive, viral spectacle they were already halfway enjoying. But rage, when it becomes pure and clean enough, gets incredibly quiet. I opened my phone. First, I canceled the first-class flights to Paris. Second, I called my private banker and executed a brutal, instantaneous freeze on every single joint checking and savings account that required mutual review under our strict marital asset agreement. Millions of dollars of liquid cash were instantly locked away in a vault Jake could no longer touch. Then, I dialed the direct cell phone number of our lead corporate attorney, Martin Keller. He had been my father's ruthless, fiercely loyal lawyer for decades before he inherited my portfolio. "Emma," Martin answered on the second ring, instantly alarmed by the dead, flat tone of my voice. "What happened?" "My husband just got engaged," I said, "to his CEO." There was a silence on the line so profound, so absolutely complete. I could clearly hear Martin breathing in his office in Manhattan. Then Martin said sharply, "I am getting in my car. I'm on my way to your house right now." "No," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. "Start with the holding company." Another heavy silence. "Emma, are you absolutely sure?" I looked through the windshield of my car, staring at the heavy metal elevator doors leading back up to the office. A small, pathetic, lingering part of my heart half expected Jake to burst through those doors, breathless, panicked, and begging for forgiveness. The doors remained completely closed. He never came. "Yes," I said. "Withdraw the full financial position, Martin." "Emma, you know what will happen. That will instantly trigger a catastrophic capital event clause. It will freeze Harlow Reed's global credit line. It will absolutely collapse their massive pending corporate acquisition." "I know." I ended the call, dropped the phone into my purse, and started the engine. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the financial shockwaves were already hitting. My phone started ringing, and ringing, and ringing. I didn't answer, and now, an hour later, I was standing in the foyer of my silent home, listening to the man who had just proposed to another woman pounding desperately on my heavy front door. The knock at the door, the pounding on the oak door grew more frantic. "Emma, Emma, please, open the door. We need to talk." Jake's voice was muffled through the thick wood, stripped of all its earlier charismatic bravado. He sounded panicked, breathless, and utterly terrified. I didn't move. I stood perfectly still in the center of the marble foyer, watching the brass doorknob rattle violently. "Emma, I know you're in there. My key card won't work. The security gate code was changed. Please, just let me explain." I walked slowly to the door. I didn't open it. I simply pressed the button for the intercom system. "There is absolutely nothing to explain, Jake," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the outdoor speaker. The rattling stopped instantly. I could hear him panting heavily on the front porch. "Emma, baby, please. What you saw today, it wasn't what it looked like. It was a PR stunt for the investors Amanda needed to secure the media narrative for the merger. It was fake." I actually let out a dry, humorless laugh. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the lie was almost impressive. "A PR stunt," I repeated flatly. "You bought a flawless, 3-carat emerald-cut diamond ring, got down on one knee in front of 200 employees, and passionately kissed another woman on the mouth for public relations." "Yes, Emma, I swear to God. You know how cutthroat the tech industry is right now. The board demanded a stable, unified leadership image. And her crying, her mouthing, 'Do we know each other?' to me, was that part of the script, too?" Silence. A heavy, suffocating, guilty silence hung over the intercom. Emma. His voice dropped, losing the frantic lie, shifting into something much darker and more manipulative. Please, open the door. You're overreacting. You're having an emotional episode. If you just let me inside, I can make you understand. But you cannot do this. You cannot pull the capital from the firm. You're going to destroy everything I've built. Everything you've built. I asked softly, the ice in my veins hardening into solid steel. Yes, I am the founder of Harlow Reed. I am the face of this company. You're going to bankrupt us over a misunderstanding. I leaned closer to the intercom microphone. 14 years ago, Jake, I said, my voice deadly calm, when Harlow Reed was nothing but a half-developed, buggy software platform, a cheap folding table, and a name I had scrawled on a yellow legal pad at 2 a.m. You did not talk about being the sole founder. I heard him swallow hard through the speaker. Back then, you talked about our dreams. We built it together. You had the charisma, and I had the architecture. You could sell a crowded room, and I could build the actual, functional code you were selling. We were a team. I paused, letting the weight of history crush him. My father had been the first angel investor, I continued. Not because he trusted your slick pitches, Jake. He gave you the money because he trusted me. After he died, his shares moved into my family holding company. And over the years, through additional funding rounds, strategic buybacks, and carefully structured legal agreements that you happily signed, my holding company came to fully control 83% of Harlow Reed Technologies. Emma, you don't understand the corporate fallout. I understand perfectly, I cut him off. You knew this, of course. You knew it every single time you asked me to stay out of the public-facing role because investors are more comfortable when there is a single, male operational voice. You knew it when you manipulated me into believing my privacy was an advantage, while you soaked up the magazine covers and champagne toasts. Emma, please. You knew it every time an article called you the sole genius founder, and I corrected absolutely no one, because I told myself that a good marriage was not a competition for credit. I took a deep breath, feeling the last, lingering ghost of my love for him evaporate into nothingness. But knowing a fact and respecting it are two very different things, Jake. The company you just proposed to another woman inside of, you don't own it. I do. Emma. Jake roared, finally losing his temper, slamming his fist against the heavy oak door. You can't just pull capital like that. There are legal procedures. There are fiduciary obligations. You are going to ruin the lives of 200 employees. That is the first honest thing you have said all day, I replied coldly. And their lives should have mattered to you before you turned their workplace into your personal, narcissistic engagement party. Jake had no answer. He stood on the porch, panting, completely trapped. For years, Jake had relied heavily on constant movement to avoid accountability. If a conversation at home became uncomfortable, he walked into another room. If a question about our marriage got too precise, he took a sudden business call. If I asked about the loneliness in our house, he blamed critical software deadlines. But now he was standing on a porch with absolutely nowhere to go. And the life he had so carefully, maliciously divided into separate rooms had finally, violently collapsed into one single house. Does Amanda know the truth now? I asked. His silence was a deafening answer. I nodded slowly to myself. Then go explain it to your fiancée. Tell her you don't own the company. Tell her you are broke. And tell her your wife says, congratulations on the engagement. Emma, please, are you divorcing me? I paused. The word should have felt incredibly dramatic. Instead, it felt highly administrative, like officially naming a dull, tedious document that had already been drafted by years of small, thousands of humiliations I had actively chosen not to count. Yes, I said. His voice broke. And the company? I looked at the heavy, locked door through the narrowing space of my empathy. The company, I said, was never truly yours to begin with. Have your lawyer call Martin Keller. I turned off the intercom system, walked away from the door, and stood in the quiet hallway. I listened as he knocked once, twice more, and then finally stopped. A minute later, his car door slammed aggressively. Through the front window, I watched him sit behind the steering wheel of his expensive Audi without starting the engine. His shoulders were slumped heavily, his phone pressed frantically to his ear. I did not know whether he was calling Amanda, the panicked board of directors, or a defense lawyer. And for the very first time in 14 years, I did not care. At exactly 7:30 p.m., I sat down at my long marble kitchen table. The house was completely silent, save for the faint, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I was wearing a simple, elegant navy cashmere sweater, a glass of iced lemon water resting beside my glowing laptop screen. On the other end of the secure, encrypted video connection was Martin Keller, my lead attorney, sitting in his Manhattan office. One by one, the elite board members of Harlow Reed Technologies joined the emergency video conference. Each of these highly paid, fiercely ambitious corporate directors logged on looking visibly stunned, incredibly careful, and professionally terrified. And then Jake appeared on the screen. He was no longer standing on my front porch in the freezing dark. He had retreated to his sanctuary. He was sitting at the massive, polished desk in his corner executive office, directly beneath the framed, glowing magazine cover that had arrogantly crowned him the man who reinvented medical data. The glittering, sprawling skyline of Manhattan glowed beautifully behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. But the man sitting in the foreground was a wreck. His designer tie was completely gone. The top two buttons of his bespoke shirt were undone. His hair was ruffled, and his eyes were bloodshot. For a man who had spent a decade meticulously mastering every single public appearance, he suddenly looked remarkably, pathetically ordinary. His webcam activated. His eyes immediately locked directly onto my video feed. In that split second, the heavy, suffocating realization finally crashed down upon the entire board of directors. Every single high-powered executive in that digital meeting finally, truly understood that the quiet, introverted woman they had treated like an irrelevant footnote at corporate dinners was the absolute only reason they still had a multi-million-dollar company to save. The board meeting began without the usual, superficial corporate small talk. No one asked about anyone's weekend. No one made a passing comment about the weather. Even the company's general counsel, an older man who had an annoying habit of opening difficult meetings with an awkward icebreaker, simply cleared his throat aggressively and called the meeting to order. Emma. Martin's voice came through my private earpiece quietly before anyone else spoke on the main feed. Answer absolutely only what you are directly asked. Do not volunteer information. Control the room through silence. I gave a microscopic nod. The chairman of the board, a seasoned veteran of Wall Street, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looking deeply uncomfortable. We have received a formal, binding legal notice this afternoon. The chairman began carefully, his eyes darting to his notes. We have been informed that Carter Family Holdings has aggressively withdrawn its entire equity commitment and permanently suspended all discretionary capital support for Harlow Reed Technologies, effective immediately. No one on the screen looked at Jake. Every single eye was glued to my square on the video grid. Mrs. Carter, the chairman continued, his voice tight, can you confirm for the official corporate record that this notice is authentic? Yes, I answered. One word. Clear as a bell. And can you formally confirm that Carter Family Holdings remains the absolute beneficial owner of 83% of all voting shares in Harlow Reed Technologies? Yes, I replied smoothly. The suffocating silence that followed my answer seemed to stretch into eternity. Several directors on the call had known the basic ownership structure on paper, of course, but abstract ownership documents buried in legal filing cabinets and brutal, operational reality were two entirely different things. For years, Jake had relentlessly marketed himself as the face, the soul, and the architect of the company. Employees blindly quoted his speeches. Angel investors photographed him. Industry reporters universally called him the founder. Somewhere along the way, due to his aggressive narcissistic branding, people had simply begun believing that extreme visibility equated to majority ownership. Jake had believed that intoxicating lie most of all. He leaned frantically toward his webcam, his hands planted flat on his desk. Emma, please, do not make catastrophic, permanent financial decisions based on today's raw emotions. We can talk about this. Martin placed a hand lightly over his microphone on his end, a silent visual reminder for me not to respond to the bait. I looked directly into my camera, addressing the board, utterly ignoring my husband. I made absolutely no emotional decisions today, gentlemen, I answered calmly, my voice devoid of a single tremor. I simply methodically executed financial rights that have existed in ink for 14 years. Jake closed his eyes in sheer agony, his head dropping slightly. The chairman turned his digital gaze toward the cornered CEO. Jake, is there anything you need to formally disclose to this board before we continue with assessing the damage? A long, agonizing pause. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice cracking. My personal situation has become highly complicated. Complicated? One of the senior directors repeated flatly, her voice dripping with sheer disbelief. Another board member, Linda Foster, folded her hands on her desk, leaning closely into her camera. Let us be precise, Mr. Carter. Did you actively represent yourself inside this corporate headquarters as an unmarried man? Jake hesitated, swallowing hard. Yes. Were you, in fact, legally married to our majority shareholder the entire time? Yes. Were any members of executive leadership, specifically HR or the ethics committee, aware of your marriage? No. The virtual room became painfully, brutally quiet. No one on that board cared about the moral failing of infidelity. They were cutthroat capitalists. What they cared about was that the chief executive officer had willfully, maliciously concealed material personal facts from his investors, while conducting a highly public, explosive romantic relationship with another C-suite executive inside the company. Corporate governance had just violently mutated into an apocalyptic legal liability. The general counsel spoke, next, his tone clinical. Given these massive disclosures and the resulting catastrophic withdrawal of our primary capital, I formally recommend placing Mr. Carter on immediate, unpaid administrative leave pending a hostile, independent investigation. Jake looked directly into his camera, his eyes wide with horror. You can't be serious. I built this company. You need me for the acquisition merger. The chairman sighed heavily, removing his glasses. I desperately wish we weren't serious, Jake, but your access is revoked. By 8:30 that evening, the explosive news had not yet leaked to the national media, but inside the glass walls of Harlow Reed, absolutely everyone knew. Corporate rumors travel infinitely faster than any official press release. Someone from the night shift noticed Jake leaving the executive floor, completely silent, carrying a pathetic brown cardboard box of personal items. Someone else noticed Amanda Blake's corner office door staying locked from the inside. Building security quietly, efficiently deactivated Jake's executive black card access. The video of the Valentine's Day engagement proposal spread like wildfire through private, encrypted employee group chats within minutes. No one posted anything publicly. Not yet. They were all too terrified of the fallout. The forged empire the next morning. I woke up after barely 3 hours of fitful sleep. For the absolute first time in 14 years, Jake wasn't lying beside me. The silence in the massive house felt strange. It wasn't lonely exactly, just profoundly unfamiliar. I made a pot of black coffee, fed our aging golden retriever, Murphy, and stood by the kitchen window in my robe, watching the neighborhood children wait for the yellow school bus in the morning frost. Life outside my property lines continued exactly as it always had. That simple, mundane realization grounded me. My personal world had shattered into a million pieces. Yes, but the rest of the world was still spinning. At 9:15 a.m., Martin Keller arrived at my front door, carrying two incredibly thick, heavy leather folders. The major investment banks have officially responded, Martin said without preamble as I invited him inside. We sat at the dining room table. They've formally suspended the acquisition financing. They pulled the plug. I expected that, I said, sipping my coffee. They are urgently asking whether Carter Family Holdings intends to remain invested in Harlow Reed after a complete executive restructuring, Martin continued, watching me closely. I looked at the heavy leather folders without opening them. And what exactly did you tell them, Martin? The absolute truth. Martin smiled, a very faint, dangerous smirk. I told them the true owner still deeply believes in the architecture of the company. That surprised me. I raised an eyebrow. He noticed my reaction. You never actually wanted to destroy Harlow Reed, Emma, Martin said softly. You built the code. It's your baby. No, I agreed, tracing the rim of my mug. I just wanted to permanently stop one arrogant man from pretending he owned it. Exactly. People always mistakenly imagine that revenge is about blindly burning everything down to the ashes. Sometimes true revenge simply means forcefully refusing to let a parasite keep stealing credit for what you built. Around noon, my cell phone buzzed on the table. Amanda Blake. I stared at the glowing name of the CEO for several long seconds before picking it up. Hello, I answered neutrally. Her voice sounded absolutely nothing like the commanding, polished tone she used during elite board meetings. It was quiet, shaking, and incredibly fragile. I know I probably have absolutely no right to call you, Amanda whispered. No, I answered honestly, offering no polite cushion. You probably don't. She accepted the harsh truth without arguing. I didn't know, Emma. I swear to you on my life. I believe you. She exhaled sharply over the phone, as though she'd been anxiously holding her breath all morning, waiting for me to scream at her. He told me he'd been completely separated from his ex for almost 2 years. I know, I said. He said the official divorce paperwork was just indefinitely delayed because of complex business assets and NDAs. I know. He showed me an apartment lease in his name. That made me pause. The air in my lungs turned cold. What apartment? Silence. Then Amanda answered, her voice breaking. He rented a luxury penthouse apartment downtown. He told me it was his bachelor pad. That's where we spent our weekends. I stared blankly at the kitchen wall. Jake had rented an entire, expensive second apartment, not to actually live in, but specifically to support a massive structural lie. Every late client meeting, every overnight strategy session in the city, every emergency business trip that mysteriously ended too late to drive back to Westport. There had always been somewhere else he was going, not just because he needed another romantic life, but because he needed physical, architectural evidence to prove to his mistress that he was a single man. I feel physically sick, Amanda whispered, a suppressed sob catching in her throat. You should, I replied coldly. I never would have let him touch me if I knew. I know, her voice cracked entirely. I am so incredibly sorry. For the absolute first time since the devastating spectacle on Valentine's Day, I heard genuine, unadulterated remorse from someone connected to this disaster. It wasn't the frantic, reputation-saving panic of Jake. It was the devastating realization of a woman who had just realized she was the villain in someone else's story. I believe you're truly sorry, Amanda, I said softly. But sorry doesn't undo what happened under that skylight. No, she paused, sniffing. Will you ever forgive me? I looked out the window at the frost on the lawn. I don't know you well enough to forgive you. She didn't argue. Instead, she quietly said, That's fair. Goodbye, Emma. Late that afternoon, Martin called me again. Emma, we found something. His tone immediately caught my absolute attention. It wasn't the voice of a divorce lawyer. It was the voice of a criminal prosecutor. "What is it?" "Old corporate authorization records. I need you to drive to my office immediately." When I arrived at his Manhattan firm, he had spread dozens of classified corporate documents across the massive glass conference table. Executive expense approvals, private equity transfer forms, offshore investment authorizations, massive vendor contracts. At first glance, they looked entirely ordinary, standard corporate bureaucracy. Then Martin took out a laser pointer and highlighted several signatures at the bottom of the pages. "They're yours," Martin said. I frowned, leaning closer to examine the blue ink. "No, Martin. They're excellent, high-grade copies." My stomach began to violently tighten. "I never signed these documents." "I know." He slid another document perfectly beside them. My actual, authentic signature from a tax return. The microscopic difference became horrifyingly obvious. The slant of the E, the pressure of the pen, tiny, almost invisible to the naked eye, but definitively obvious to a trained expert. Jake hadn't simply betrayed our sacred marriage vows. Someone, almost certainly my husband, had been aggressively, systematically forging my legal signature on highly classified, multi-million-dollar corporate documents for years. Martin folded his hands, his eyes dark. "We are having our forensic accounting analysts review every single executive authorization from the last 5 years. How many documents are there?" I whispered. "Hundreds." I slowly sat back in the heavy leather chair. Every single emotion I had carried since Valentine's Day violently shifted on its axis. Until that exact moment, I had believed the story was simply about devastating infidelity, a midlife crisis, a cheating, arrogant husband. Now, it was rapidly mutating into something infinitely darker and much larger. Severe corporate misconduct, wire fraud, embezzlement, possible federal criminal exposure. Martin looked at me carefully, assessing my shock. "Emma, you need to mentally prepare yourself." "For what?" "If the independent investigation officially confirms what we deeply suspect." He paused, adjusting his tie. "Jake isn't just going to lose his marriage and his CEO title." I finished the horrifying sentence for him, my blood running cold. "He's going to lose absolutely everything." Martin didn't answer. He didn't need to. The smoking gun evidence, spread across the conference table, had already delivered the verdict. As I stared at the forged, counterfeit signatures bearing my name, I realized something that chilled me to the absolute bone, far more than the engagement party ever had. Jake hadn't just carelessly crossed one line in a moment of weakness. He had been maliciously, criminally crossing lines for half a decade. Valentine's Day hadn't created the disaster. It had merely provided the spark that illuminated the massive powder keg he had been building under our lives. The audit and the execution the next 48 hours moved with the cold, terrifying, unstoppable precision of a military machine. Martin brought in a ruthless forensic accounting firm from New York, the kind of elite, shadowy investigators who did not ask unnecessary questions and did not use dramatic language unless a document definitively proved a felony. They set up their war room inside a locked, heavily guarded conference room at Harlow Reed headquarters. Badge access was strictly restricted. The blinds were permanently drawn. Laptops glowed brightly beside dozens of banker boxes filled with old board packets, offshore wire approvals, and executive compensation files. I did not go to the office. That was highly deliberate. If I walked into that building too soon, the rumor mill would instantly turn the federal investigation into a petty, personal war between a scorned wife and a cheating husband. I wanted no tabloid gossip, no hallway whispers about a woman's revenge. No excuse whatsoever for Jake's defense team to claim I was acting from heartbreak rather than hard, empirical evidence. So I stayed home in Westport, answered complex financial questions through Martin over encrypted lines, and let the stone-cold professionals do what Jake had always arrogantly underestimated. They followed the paper trail. By the third day, the analysts found the undeniable pattern. It was not one forged signature, or even a handful of lazy mistakes. It was an entire, massive ecosystem of fraud. My name and my controlling shares had been maliciously used to authorize temporary executive loans to Jake's personal accounts. It had been used to approve wildly inflated travel reimbursements. It had been used to fast-track lucrative vendor contracts tied to offshore shell companies run by people Jake knew personally. None of it was reckless enough to scream fraud at first untrained glance. That was what made it so incredibly dangerous. It was polished, expertly layered, and beautifully wrapped in dense corporate legal language, clean enough to pass through busy accountants' hands. But lies age terribly. Every document had a digital timestamp. Every approval had metadata. Every illicit wire transfer left a breadcrumb trail. At 6:12 p.m. on Thursday evening, Martin called me. "Emma," he said, his voice grave, "we have enough." I was standing quietly in my laundry room, mindlessly folding one of Jake's crisp, white dress shirts, because domestic habit is sometimes the absolute last part of love to die. I looked down at the expensive fabric in my hands, at the custom monogram on the French cuff, and suddenly felt incredibly foolish for even touching it. I dropped the shirt onto the floor. "Enough for the board to fire him?" I asked. "Enough for the board to terminate for extreme cause. Enough for massive civil action. And definitively enough for a referral to federal authorities for wire fraud," Martin confirmed. I closed my eyes. For one brief, pathetic second, the ghost of the girl who had loved him wished the truth had been smaller. Wished it had just been a stupid affair. Then I vividly remembered Jake passionately kissing Amanda under the atrium skylight, while 200 people wildly applauded his magnificent lie. "Then send the files to the board," I said. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the very next morning. This time, Jake was not invited into the meeting as the chief executive officer. He was summoned as the primary subject of a hostile corporate investigation. Amanda Blake appeared on the video call from her home office, looking pale, exhausted, but fiercely composed. She had immediately voluntarily resigned from all operational decision-making connected to Jake's departments, and the board had formally accepted her recusal. She did not desperately defend herself. She did not try to blame me. When the chairman asked her point-blank whether she had known Jake was legally married, she answered clearly without a tremor, no. He looked me in the eye and told me he had been separated and in divorce proceedings for 2 years. "And did he ever disclose to you that Mrs. Carter, his wife, controlled the ultimate majority ownership of this entire company?" Amanda looked down at her desk for a moment, her voice filled with quiet shame. "No, he told me his wife had absolutely no operational involvement, and that the ownership structure was just old family paperwork, that he was in the process of buying out." The phrase landed heavily in the virtual boardroom. Old family paperwork. That was what Jake had arrogantly reduced my brilliant code, my late father's crucial early investment, my years of unpaid labor, and my supportive silence to. A tedious administrative hurdle. Then, the forensic accountants took the floor. They did not raise their voices. They did not need to. The sheer volume of the evidence was deafening. They projected forged signatures on the screen. They showed the IP addresses and metadata, proving Jake had signed them from his private terminal. They displayed the illicit wire approvals, the shell company lease agreements, and the executive expense records. They showed the massive lease for the luxury apartment downtown that Jake had illegally classified as a strategic client hospitality suite and paid for with company funds. They showed astronomical jewelry purchases, including Amanda's diamond ring, maliciously labeled as investor relations gifts to bypass audits. They showed private jet travel booked through corporate accounts, romantic weekend getaways Amanda had naively believed were executive business retreats. Jake had surrounded every single lie with just enough forged paperwork to make it look brilliantly legitimate. Amanda covered her mouth with her hand once. Only once, a stifled gasp escaping her as she saw the receipt for her engagement ring. Jake sat completely frozen in his chair, sweating profusely. When he finally tried to speak, his voice sounded incredibly thin, stripped of all its legendary charisma. This data is being completely taken out of context. You don't understand the pressures of scaling a unicorn tech firm. The lead forensic investigator, a terrifyingly calm woman named Denise Lettle, adjusted her glasses and looked at him like a specimen under a microscope. "Mr. Carter," Denise said flatly, "metadata does not have context. It has cryptographic timestamps. It is absolute." No one on the board smiled, but I almost did. Jake tried again, desperation clawing at his throat. "I had full executive authority to act on behalf of the company's financial interests." "You had operational authority, Mr. Carter," Denise corrected him sharply. "You absolutely did not have the authority to forge our majority shareholder's signature to embezzle funds." His panicked eyes moved to my video feed then, and for the absolute first time in our 14 years together, there was pure, unadulterated hatred beneath his fear. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" he spat at the camera, losing his mind. "You planned this." I felt every single face on the call instantly turn toward me, waiting for my reaction. I could have denied it. I could have played the weeping victim. Instead, I looked him dead in the eye and told the absolute truth, my voice carrying the weight of a judge passing sentence. "No, Jake," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "I am absolutely not enjoying this. I am surviving it." That completely silenced him. By noon, the board of directors voted unanimously. They moved to terminate Jake Carter immediately for extreme cause, permanently revoke all his unvested equity compensation and golden parachutes, and refer the explosive findings to outside federal counsel for criminal and civil recovery. His name, his photos, and his history would be aggressively scrubbed from all active company materials until the legal matters were resolved. Amanda Blake would remain on administrative leave pending the completion of her own ethics review, though preliminary findings already heavily showed she had been the victim of his deception rather than complicit in the fraud. It was not dramatic. There was no shouting. No one threw a glass of water. The true, devastating revenge came in the form of digital signatures, unanimous votes, and permanently locked bank accounts. And somehow that quiet, administrative execution made it feel infinitely more complete. The wreckage and the rebuilding that same afternoon. Amanda Blake asked to meet me in person. I almost refused her email outright. Then I thought of the look of sheer, humiliating horror on her face when she learned about the fake bachelor pad apartment, and I realized there was one final, necessary conversation left that Jake did not get to control. We met at a small, independent coffee shop in Fairfield, far away from the corporate office and far from anyone who might recognize the CEO and the majority shareholder of Harlow Reed. Amanda arrived first. She wore absolutely no makeup, a simple beige trench coat, and her hands were bare. The multi-million-dollar diamond ring was permanently gone. When I sat across from her in the booth, she immediately stood up. "I'm sorry," she said. "You already said that on the phone," I replied, ordering a black coffee. "I know," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "but I needed to say it while looking you in the eye." I studied her face intensely. I searched for any trace of the arrogance I had seen on that stage, any hint of victory, any trace of the radiant, untouchable woman accepting the applause of 200 people. I found absolutely none. There was just humiliation, the clean, brutal, soul-crushing kind. "I genuinely believed him, Emma," she whispered, wrapping her hands around her mug. "That is not a legal excuse," I said calmly. "It's not an excuse," she agreed, a tear slipping down her cheek. "It's just the pathetic truth. I am a smart woman, and I let him blind me. I know. He made me feel incredibly chosen," she said softly. That specific sentence hurt me far more than I expected it to, because I understood it in my bones. Jake had always known exactly how to make a woman feel like the entire room had magically rearranged itself around her. It was his superpower and his weapon. Amanda looked down at her bare hands. When I saw you in the atrium holding those flowers, I thought you were an investor's wife or someone from the charity board dropping off a gift. I didn't know I was looking at the woman whose life I was currently standing inside and destroying. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the coffee shop espresso machine filled the silence. Then I looked at her and said, "He lied to both of us, Amanda. He manipulated both of us. But he married me. His first, absolute duty was to me, not you." She nodded rapidly, tears filling her eyes. I know. I could have hated her forever. Part of me deeply wanted to. Hatred would have been infinitely easier than confronting the uncomfortable, nuanced truth that the other woman was not always a conniving monster. Sometimes she was just another naive person standing in the wreckage, holding a different, jagged piece of the exact same lie. "I won't protect you from the corporate consequences, Amanda," I said, my tone shifting to business. "The ethics review will be thorough." "I'm not asking you to protect me," she said bravely. "But," I continued, "I also won't punish you for the crimes he committed alone. The board will be fair." Her eyes lifted to mine, swimming with gratitude. That was not forgiveness. Not yet, but it was justice. 3 nights later, Jake finally came back to the house in Westport. This time he did not ring the doorbell over and over like a madman. He knocked once, heavily, and then waited in the freezing cold. Through the front window, I saw a man who looked absolutely nothing like the confident, untouchable husband I had brought Valentine's flowers to just days ago. His expensive wool coat was deeply wrinkled. His face was covered in a rough, patchy beard. The blinding, charismatic confidence had completely drained out of him, and without it, he seemed physically smaller, almost unfamiliar. I opened the heavy front door, but I left the brass security chain firmly in place. He looked at the chain, then up at my face. "I suppose I deserve that." "Yes," I replied flatly. "You do." He swallowed hard, shivering in the wind. "I lost the company, Emma." "No," I corrected him. "You lost the arrogant illusion that the company was ever yours." His eyes filled with sudden tears, but I did not soften my gaze. Not because I actively wanted him to suffer, but because I had spent way too many years of my life softening every hard, uncomfortable truth so he could effortlessly step around it. I was done being his cushion. "I'm not here to ask you to magically stop the federal investigation," he said, his voice cracking. "Good. I'm not here to ask you to take me back." "Good." He nodded slowly, as if producing each word cost him agonizing physical pain. "I just came to say, I am truly sorry. The old Emma, the naive woman from a week ago, would have unhooked the chain and reached for the door. The old Emma would have tragically mistaken his profound regret for genuine repair. But the woman standing in the foyer now had watched too much of her world burn to the ground to ever confuse the smoke of a fire with the warmth of a hearth. "Are you truly sorry because you broke my heart and destroyed our marriage?" I asked, staring into his soul. "Or are you just sorry because your perfect, fake life finally fell apart?" Jake looked down at his expensive shoes. For a long, long time, the only sound was the winter wind howling through the maple trees. Then, very quietly, the great CEO finally answered, "I don't know anymore." And that was the absolute first, genuinely honest thing he had said to me since Valentine's Day. Jake stood on the porch for another minute, lingering, desperately waiting for me to say something, anything that would make his impending, terrifying future less frightening. I didn't. The heavy silence between us no longer belonged to bitter resentment. It finally belonged to the absolute truth. Finally, he nodded, accepting his fate. "I understand." I wasn't entirely sure he did, but for the first time in 14 years, making him understand was no longer my responsibility. I closed the door gently, not angrily, and watched through the sidelight as he walked slowly back to his car. He didn't look back once. His shoulders were slumped, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, moving heavily like a man who had spent a decade ruthlessly climbing toward a summit, only to realize at the very top that he had been carrying the wrong map the entire time. Murphy the golden retriever wandered into the foyer and rested his warm head against my leg. I scratched behind his soft ears and whispered into the quiet, safe house, "I think we're going to be okay, Murph." For the first time since the atrium, I truly believed it. Epilogue. The architecture of Peace the Divorce took 8 grueling months. Real, high-asset divorces usually do. There were brutal financial disclosures, forensic property evaluations, exhausting depositions, and more complex legal paperwork than either of us thought possible. But because of our ironclad prenuptial agreement and the undeniable ownership structure of the holding company that had existed long before our marriage, the legal process was surprisingly straightforward. Emotionally, however, nothing about it felt simple. Jake never formally contested my ownership of Harlow Reed. He legally couldn't. The documents had existed for over a decade, and the forensic investigation had completely removed any illusion that the company belonged to anyone else. The civil and criminal claims related to his forged signatures continued through separate, relentless federal counsel. Those dark matters were eventually resolved through heavily negotiated settlements, massive financial restitution that bankrupted him, and permanent, binding legal restrictions banning Jake from ever serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded or governed company again. It was an agonizing, humiliating outcome for him. But it was also the direct mathematical consequence of malicious choices made repeatedly over a decade, not the result of a single, terrible afternoon. Justice, I learned in those months, rarely arrives all at once with a dramatic bang. It arrives slowly, methodically, in carefully numbered pages. Amanda Blake successfully completed her grueling ethics review. The independent investigators unequivocally found absolutely zero evidence that she had participated in the forged documents or knowingly benefited from the financial misconduct. Her greatest, most devastating mistake had simply been blindly believing the lies of the manipulative man she loved. The board officially voted to reinstate her as CEO 6 weeks later. Before accepting the position, Amanda called me on my private line. "I won't take the position," she said quietly, "if you think I shouldn't." I appreciated the profound respect of the question more than she probably realized. "You earned the job, Amanda," I replied honestly. "But because of everything, because of the history, because of everything," I interrupted her gently, "don't ever waste the chance to lead this company honestly." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't expect us to ever become friends, Emma. I don't either. But I hope one day you'll truly believe that I never, ever wanted to steal your life." I looked out my kitchen window at the first, beautiful green signs of spring pushing bravely through the frozen, dead flower beds. "I already believe that, Amanda." When we ended the call, I realized that true forgiveness had quietly arrived without announcing itself. It wasn't complete forgiveness. It wasn't the magical kind that erased all the ugly scars. It was just exactly enough to stop carrying the heavy, exhausting burden of someone else's guilt on my shoulders. The board of directors practically begged me to formally take over as CEO. For years, that had seemed like the obvious, inevitable next step in my career. Years earlier, I might have accepted the crown without a second thought. Instead, I surprised absolutely everyone in the financial sector, including myself. "No," the chairman blinked, confused. "But Emma, you literally built this company's architecture." "Yes, I did." "And you legally own the vast majority of it." "Yes." "Then why refuse the title?" I smiled, a sense of profound peace washing over me. "Because, gentlemen, ownership and daily purpose are not always the exact same thing. I accepted the powerful role of executive chair of the board instead. I focused entirely on high-level, long-term global strategy, while happily leaving the grueling, daily operational management and public-facing interviews to Amanda. It was the exact perfect arrangement I should have confidently chosen years earlier. Not because I lacked the ability to lead publicly, but because true leadership works best when it authentically reflects who you actually are, instead of who other people expect you to become. For the first time in its history, the company felt completely, structurally honest. 3 months after Valentine's Day, I was cleaning out my home office and found the sleek black envelope containing the Paris tickets tucked far back inside a desk drawer. The first-class flights had long since been refunded. The boutique hotel reservation was canceled. The little, heartfelt, handwritten card I had written for Jake remained folded inside. I read the words I had written to him once more. Then I smiled, a soft, sad, but entirely liberated smile, and fed the card directly through the paper shredder, not out of lingering anger, but out of total acceptance. That evening, I opened my laptop and booked another trip. The exact same city, a different, far more luxurious hotel. One ticket. Paris greeted me with brilliant, warm spring sunshine and bustling cafes spilling out onto narrow, romantic sidewalks. I walked the historic streets, entirely without an itinerary. I lingered for hours in dusty, beautiful bookstores where I understood only half the French language. I sat alone on a bench beside the Seine with a cup of rich coffee that grew completely cold, because I was too busy happily watching the vibrant people of the world instead of drinking it. On my second evening, I crossed the famous Pont d'Arts Bridge just as the Parisian sky turned a breathtaking, fiery gold. Years earlier, on our honeymoon, Jake and I had stood on this exact same bridge, making grand, sweeping promises about our invincible future. This time, standing alone in the wind, I made one unbreakable promise strictly to myself. Never, ever confuse being needed with being valued. They are not the same thing. Nearly a year later, Harlow Reed Technologies hosted a massive gala to announce a new, multi-million-dollar investment initiative supporting early-stage healthcare technology, companies founded exclusively by women and underrepresented entrepreneurs. The brilliant idea had been sitting neglected in one of my old notebooks for almost a decade. Now we had finally, proudly built it. At the launch event, Amanda introduced the program from the stage. She eloquently thanked the board. She thanked our dedicated employees. And then, completely unexpectedly, she turned and publicly thanked me. Some people build highly profitable companies, Amanda said into the microphone, her voice ringing clear. Others build rare cultures, where the absolute truth eventually matters far more than public appearances. We are all standing here tonight because Emma Carter refused to sacrifice either. The applause that followed her words echoed through the room, and it sounded profoundly, fundamentally different from the deafening applause I had heard on Valentine's Day. That applause a year ago had celebrated a toxic illusion. This applause honored integrity, survival, and truth. The difference mattered more than I could ever express. A few weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. Not a sterile email, not a cowardly text message, a handwritten letter. It was from Jake. He wrote that he had been legally barred from the C-suite and had taken a low-level management position at a very small, struggling regional software company in rural Vermont. It wasn't glamorous. There were absolutely no magazine interviews, no keynote speeches in Dallas, no sweeping corner office with a skyline view. He wrote that every single morning he unlocked the dark office himself, made the coffee for the small staff, and left every evening knowing exactly what his new title meant, employee. He apologized to me again, not for losing the $500 million company, not for losing his golden reputation, but for spending a decade of his life arrogantly believing that corporate success entitled him to completely ignore the sacred promises he had made to the person who loved him most. At the very bottom of the page, his handwriting trembled slightly as he wrote one final sentence. I hope one day I manage to become someone truly worthy of the forgiveness I asked for. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a wooden box with old, faded photographs. Not because I ever wanted to romantically relive the past, but because pretending the trauma never happened would teach me absolutely nothing. Some chapters of our lives deserve to stay permanently closed, but they do not deserve to be erased. People sometimes ask me whether my brutal corporate revenge brought me peace. The honest, complicated answer is no. Revenge gave me survival. It gave me the justice I was owed. Peace came much, much later. Peace finally arrived on the quiet day I completely stopped measuring my own future by the weight of someone else's betrayal. Jake lost his marriage because he actively chose deception over honesty. He lost his brilliant career because he chose blind ambition over integrity. He lost his empire because he foolishly forgot that borrowed power is never, ever the same thing as earned trust. As for me, I didn't win simply because he lost. I won because I finally remembered that my inherent worth had never, ever depended on whether an arrogant man recognized it. Sometimes the absolute strongest revenge isn't ruthlessly destroying the person who hurt you. It is fiercely, unapologetically refusing to let their toxic choices destroy the person you were always meant to become. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if you had been in Emma's shoes? Would you have made the same ruthless choices to protect your empire or taken a different path? Share your perspective in the comments below. And if you enjoy thoughtful, intense stories about betrayal, justice, resilience, and second chances, please consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey.